Yeah, I'm delighted to really talk about what prompted us to take on this topic of toxicity transparency and toxicity minimization. We actually had a colleague last year on social media, well-known Dr. Steensma, comment on an abstract that had over 90% high-grade toxicities, and also 25% of patients either discontinue a drug or may have even had a fatal adverse event, and yet the study in the regimen, the cancer regimen, was reported as well tolerated. And it kind of was quite upsetting, really, to many of us on social media. And we know that this happens quite often. We see this quite often, that highly toxic regimens are being described as well tolerated, acceptable, manageable, yet they have fatal adverse events. We also know this greatly upsets our patients and patient advocates that listen to us, and they rightfully question our objectivity if we use such minimizing terms that describe high-grade serious toxicities or even fatal toxicities and dismiss them as manageable and tolerable. They rightfully do question how objective are we really about other findings? Can they really trust us? And these are the patient advocates that actually love us, that know us as a medical community, that we strive for the best. But they rightfully question us on this language issue that we really should address, similar to other language issues that have been discussed. That is, for example, the tumor, the patient is being described as failing the therapy, but it's really not the patient that's failing, or clearly not the patient. It really is the therapy that's failing. And this is kind of on this similar aspect, but gets to the objectivity of assessing harm versus benefit. And that is the balancing act that we do in our everyday patient communications when we consent to therapy. And it really gets at the heart at how objective are we about these serious toxicities? Have we maybe normalized them too much? Have we become too desensitized, and have serious toxicity and fatal toxicities been too much of a routine for us as medical oncologists in potentially objectively describing them to the patients, so now that they have treatment options available to them? I think many of us believe we need to do a better job in being more objective in comparing various regimens that have especially if they have similar efficacy in terms of toxicity, and even beyond, as every patient is individual, and it's really only the patient that can decide what is an acceptable toxicity for them. What might they be able to tolerate? Depending on your job, depending on your life circumstances, the family that depends on you. Every patient has different limits of what is acceptable, and we need to start to respect that as a medical community as well. And so we set out, and I partnered actually with Dr. Gayawale and Dr. Lisa Hicks, who I know feel very passionate about this as well. Dr. Hicks is a leader at ASH, has been involved in several committees. Other colleagues and myself as well have been involved in other aspects of ASH. And Dr. Gayawale has actually looked at this in the medical literature in some key journals, and also has found a high rate. So we felt it was high time to assess this. So we performed a systematic review of the last 5 years of ASH abstracts, with the initial focus on acute leukemias, but then also wanted to be sure to assess other malignancies, such as many of the acute leukemias, or various types of lymphomas, I should say, as well as multiple myeloma. Phase 3 trials reported over the last 5 years, so from 2017 to 2021, that reported on phase 3 results at the ASH annual conferences. We first performed a pilot to make sure this is all highly feasible, to also ensure have we found all the necessary terms that we need to assess. And really, Dr. Gayawale has given us a really nice roadmap from the literature, and those terms were our primary findings as well, and our primary outcomes. And then we had secondary terms such as limited that we also assessed in a secondary analysis. But just focusing on the main minimization terms such as tolerable, acceptable, manageable, feasible. These terms are used in roughly about 40% of abstracts in these three major malignancies, and very similar rates in acute leukemias versus the other malignancies. 15% of abstracts did not report any toxicities. And this is we feel this is quite important, as these are the abstracts that often clinicians take home and remember. These numbers they remember and bring to the patients. That assessment, those conclusions in those abstracts, quite powerful and probably disproportionately influence clinicians, even independent what happens in the oral presentations. Of course, the oral presentations matter as well, but often people are very visual, and it's that abstract they can refer back to and they look up again to really assess those numbers of benefit and harm that we bring to the patient. And yet many abstracts don't report toxicities at all. And together, it is over 50% of these abstracts either have the objective minimization of no toxicity reporting or the subjective use of these editorializing terms that minimize these serious toxicities. So over half of abstracts have some form of toxicity minimization. And that begs the question how that influences our medical guidance, our medical decision making, our conversations with patients. And we would love to see policy changes in the medical community to really become conscious of these subjective terms that are not scientific in any fashion, just so for our own sake, for our own objectivity as scientists, as physician scientists, should we not avoid these terms that editorialize potentially serious harm or serious bothersomeness of therapies, and focus on the actual toxicities, focus on the patient voice, how do these toxicity translate to the patient experience, and focus on, I would love to see how a change in this avoidance of these terms, how that may potentially even positively impact our medical decision making. We know there are high grades of regrets that happen in patients. That literature is already quite well established, where patients after the fact realize they really wish they had known more or had a more thoughtful conversation about their medical decision making, especially about toxicities. It's often the regret is about the toxicity, the harm that they experience often for the rest of their lives, and could potentially just a simple change already in avoiding minimizations, avoiding these subjective terms, becoming more self-aware about the seriousness of the toxicities that we've gotten so used to. Might that already help our patient conversations, patient outcomes, and patient experience with the medical community?